Welcome to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll. Many of us have been stuck at home a little more than usual in recent months, and maybe some of us have been watching a little more TV than usual. And in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the ways women have been portrayed on television and what those portrayals can tell us about modern American history and culture. Our guest is Dr. Sinu Kodamthara, a professor of American history at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. Dr. Kodamthara earned her PhD in American history from the University of Oklahoma in 2011, and she's a member of the Oklahoma Humanities Board of Trustees. Sinu also wrote a great article in our new Oklahoma Humanities Magazine issue called Preserving Home and Country. The article profiles Edith Cherry Johnson, an influential columnist for the Daily Oklahoma newspaper in the early 20th century, who advocated for traditional gender roles and argued against a woman's right to vote. And we'll put a link to this article on our webpage for this podcast episode. So welcome, Sinu. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I am so excited about this episode because I've been campaigning for it for 2 years now.
We're going to talk a little bit later. That's true.
Yeah. The persistence, kids, that's the lesson. Persistence.
We're going to talk a little later about one of the main themes of this episode that you have long argued for. But before we get to that, let's jump right in and talk about, we're going to talk about four major categories or four main themes of how women have been portrayed on TV.
Yeah.
And let's start with maybe the oldest category, portrayals of what we might call, quote unquote, traditional roles for women. So what would you consider some of the most important and kind of classic traditional women characters on TV?
I think the first or the go-to is Lucille Ball, right? In I Love Lucy. And here's the thing, I've always been super critical of I Love Lucy, and that's for personal reasons. And my sister had to wake me up to how pivotal and iconic this show was, primarily because, you know, in how I understood her, I thought, here's this character who is a housewife and a stay-at-home mom eventually, who is just trying to be some sort of star in some kind of way and sort of helps to promote this stay-at-home mom type of figure, and a housewife type of ideal of the 1950s. And it was my sister who pointed out, that's not actually what's happening. She said, and I talked to her again about this even today, but she said, you know, what's actually happening though, is that Lucy, the character, and Lucille Ball, the celebrity, the comedian, the businesswoman, she's fighting against those stereotypes over and over and over again. I mean, the character is really unhappy with being a housewife, and she's unhappy with being the stay-at-home mom, and she's pushing back against those stereotypes, and that's why she wants to be a star. She knows that she can do more. She knows that she has a purpose beyond being Ricky's wife.
Yeah, her husband is a star, and she doesn't want to be in his shadow, right?
That's exactly right. She knows that she has her own identity. And she wants to pursue that. She wants to pursue that purpose. And of course, you know, in my own judgment, and this is, I accept responsibility for this, in my own judgment and anger, I said, no, this is a dumb show and I hate it. But it was, my sister correctly pointed out to me, no, she is saying, I have a purpose outside of this and I should be able to pursue that. And it's all of these other outside things that's stopping me, right? And of course, she turns it into this great comedic, iconic television show that lasts for several years. But I Love Lucy, the sitcom, will pave the way for shows like The Donna Reed Show. And The Donna Reed Show is the first sitcom that centers around a mother instead of a father, right? Donna Reed is named after the woman. The whole show is premised around the mother. And that show would not be possible without without Lucille Ball and without all of her business savvy, without her comedic talent, and without the success of her show. So I think you cannot talk about the success of women in television without giving proper due to Lucille Ball.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. My daughter and I have read, my daughter's 9, and we've read an awesome biography of Lucille Ball called I Am Lucille Ball by Brad Meltzer, I think. And it talks about her business skills. I mean, she owned her own production company, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and again, props to my sister because she definitely deserves props here. My sister said, my sister mentioned something which was really important. She said that what Lucille understood in terms of business was that in order to sell the show, she had to make it clear that Desi Arnaz was the front of it, right? That as a man, he sort of carried, and I use carried in with the quotation marks, but he sort of carried the load. So that production company at the time was named Desi Lou Productions.
Not Lou Desi.
Right. And so it was Desi Lou. He was sort of the front. And she made it seem as if he was sort of making all of the decisions. And to his credit, he was a talented producer. He too was a talented comedian. But she was the one who was making a lot of the business decisions. She would, after the show was over, she was the one who was making a lot of investment decisions with her own production company. So this was not your typical, she was not your typical celebrity, right? She had a lot of business savvy to carry on her production company into the decades ahead, to know where to invest, what kind of shows to create, and she kind of understood how the business worked. It's just that initially, because she was a woman, she just needed to know how to please the people in her audience, as well as Hollywood producers and studios, in order to get it all together. I mean, again, as my sister pointed out, she said, listen, you as a woman in 1951, you can't just go out there and say equal rights for everyone and then expect an audience to show up and stay with you. That's just not going to happen. So instead, you've got to figure out a way to make your case and then bring them along with you. And then still keep them with you for years to come. And that's what she needed to do.
So were there some ways that her character was shown to struggle against traditional female roles in the show?
Yeah, I think, so my sister pointed out that there was an episode about equal rights. And so I'm not too familiar with the show. It was my sister who had to educate me. And Suja was saying, Suja is my sister, by the way, listeners. Because
shout out to Suja.
Yeah, shout out to Suja. Suja said there's an episode specifically about equal rights, and Lucy goes on and on that women deserve equal rights, and so of course the show goes its own comedic way because Ricky says, oh, okay, you want equal rights? Well, then that means we don't pull out the chairs for you. You have to pay for dinner. You've got to do all this and that. And so, of course, they're not going to address the issues that really need to be addressed, that aren't really talked about. But the fact that she is willing to bring it up in the 1950s, and the way that she does on television, and again, this is at a time where there's only a couple of channels to watch, and most everyone in America is watching I Love Lucy. That's pretty bold and brave.
And scholars of television they've pointed out that television is a particularly intimate medium because you are inviting these people into your home. Lucy and Ricky were literally sitting in your living room, and you were alongside them in some way as she's raising some of these issues, even in a subtle way, or not taking it all the way, but it was still very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. People don't realize the power of television and media, even through situation comedy, right? I mean, to have 20 minutes to 30 minutes once a week, um, and make people laugh is one thing, but to make people laugh while still being able to get in these messages about equal rights or other issues, which we'll talk about today, it's a very, very powerful medium. And as we go through the decades, that medium becomes even more powerful, for women in particular.
Hmm.
And she seemed to understand that really well.
I guess when I was thinking about traditional portrayals, I also thought about kind of the classic 50s housewife as portrayed by definitely Donna Reed and Ozzie and Harriet, but also Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver. And one of her classic sort of the way she represents herself, the way she's represented as a mother is that she does housework while wearing heels, and she's fully decked out in a full-on dress and makeup and everything. And she does needlepoint and decorates cakes. And her role is to kind of teach lessons to the men, to her sons. That's one of, I guess, a classic portrayal of a 1950s or 60s housewife that I imagined was sort of classic. Do you think those kinds of portrayals were particularly accurate to that time?
I think it helped to reinforce what was expected of women at that time. I think that's the thing. Television was a part of, in a way, television was a part of a larger sort of media message, right? That these are sort of the expectations that we have of gender roles, that a man is supposed to have this role and a woman is supposed to have this role. So there were literally, there was a television show, one television show that was the most popular of its time was Father Knows Best. It's in the title, for crying out loud. Right?
Now that you mention it, wow.
Father Knows Best. He plays the central character. And in that particular show, there were all sorts of episodes, and they don't even hide it. It's not even subtle. Like, there's one particular episode where the Thanksgiving episode where it's all disaster. Everything goes to hell in a handbasket, and they end up having to make, I think, hamburgers for Thanksgiving, but they all gather around the table and they're praying, they hold hands and he leads them in prayer. So it sort of promotes this idea of what an American family is supposed to look like, but it fits in with this larger message of the 1950s. And that is, keep in mind, the larger context of that time period. We're in the Cold War, so we're fighting communist Russia, and we are supposed to promote this idea of what the ideal America looks like, where if you are a white middle-class family, then you are living in the suburbs, and dad goes off to work in the morning and mom stays home, and your house looks like this, and the kids behave in this way, and everybody sort of subscribes to these ideals, and you can do it in this funny, charming sort of way where all your problems are solved within 20 to 30 minutes, conveniently. And this is how it all looks. And TV helps to promote that message, right? I mean, TV helps to push that kind of Cold War type of idea that this is what the American family is supposed to look like.
There's one other portrayal that I wanted to ask you about that maybe takes place around where there's a turn away from traditional characterizations into maybe more modern ones. I'm curious, are you familiar with I Dream of Genie at all?
Yes. I loved I Dream of Genie.
Me too. Oh, wow. So some things about I Dream of Genie, the main character, some things that did not occur to me when I was watching I Dream of Genie on reruns when I was staying home sick as a kid in elementary school. So the main character keeps her in a bottle. Right. He could free her anytime.
Anytime, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anytime. She calls him Master.
Master, right.
he does free her later in the series, I guess, and they end up getting married. But I've read some criticism that points out that really one of the only smart female characters is Jeannie's evil sister. Like Jeannie herself is, although I think it's debatable because Jeannie herself is a complicated character. There are a lot of sexist jokes at women's expense, but Jeannie also kind of takes Major Nelson down a few notches at times.
Okay, but okay, but right, but I mean, with Jeannie though, the thing is like Jeannie is also, for the most part, and I think we can have a discussion here because this would be interesting. Like Jeannie, for the most part, wouldn't you agree that she is very much subscribing to the idea that she's supposed to be the humble, loyal servant to what's his name,
Yes.
Nelson? Isn't it?
Major Nelson. Yeah.
Major Nelson.
Yeah.
So like she's supposed to be like doing whatever it is that he's supposed to do, even though she's a little ditzy and clumsy and messes things up 99% of the time.
Literally, his wish is her command. Like, yeah, she is serving him. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
there's an early episode called The Americanization of Genie where she becomes interested in feminism.
Okay.
And it allows her to explore a little bit about feminism. The show ran in the mid 60s, I think, like 64 to 68, I want to say.
Okay.
And ultimately, at the end, it portrays feminism as a fad. Oh, this is a passing fad. Jeannie's she's gonna lose interest in that in 5 minutes. It's kind of amazing. But Barbara Eden, who played Jeannie, she actually argued, like later in interviews in the 70s and 80s, that there were other parts of the show that showed that she did have some agency and some critical thinking. Like there was one episode where Major Nelson gets her powers for a day, and after he often criticized her for not doing anything useful with her powers, and he did nothing useful with the powers either. So she got to point out that you've had my powers for a day and you did literally nothing useful with them. So,
I mean, okay, so there's a point. Yeah, I mean, right, and I get that. So, okay, so credit 1 point to Barbara Eden for that. I mean, so okay, but there is this, there is the counter argument to that, which is the rhetoric that's used, right? The language that's used, where she does still have to refer to him as master, that she still does have to stay in that bottle, that the entire time he does have the choice of freeing her and he chooses not to. He does exert, I mean, I guess, he has control over her. Although I guess the irony is maybe he doesn't. I don't know. It's
complicated.
It's a little bit complicated there, and maybe I think the showrunners would argue, or maybe say that it's sort of supposed to be this statement against the idea of feminism, or this argument against feminism, that you have women who are trying to be completely independent and wanting to be on their own, and men who are trying to exert their control. And here is this show that's showing this fight in the middle. Like, how do we figure out the balance between the two? When I was younger, I loved that show, and that's
it's so fun.
Yeah, it's so fun.
But it really was.
Before I knew anything.
But it probably was mirroring what was going on in the larger culture at the time, and we're talking about the mid to late 60s.
Yeah, I mean, the 60s are really interesting because the 60s bring out all of these different complicated issues, but they bring it out in so many different ways, which is why I love 60s television too.
So maybe we'll jump ahead to our next category that we were going to talk about was career women. So maybe as we're going through the 60s and then into the early 70s, perhaps, what are some of the key portrayals of career women that you thought about?
Well, see, with career women, I always go with Mary Tyler Moore, but she didn't until 1970. And I mean, if you're going to think about, I usually also think about Marlo Thomas. Marlo Thomas is that girl who's, the single woman who for her entire sitcom remains single. She never gets married. And I think it's the first sitcom where she lives on her own and lives her best life. I mean, she, the entire show is basically about her life on her own. And she's, dating and doing her own thing, but it's about her life. And she is charming and effervescent. She's Marlo Thomas. But she's everything Marlo Thomas is supposed to be. And I think what makes her successful is that she's not in your face about, and I think this is what leads to Mary Tyler Moore's success in the 1970s, is that Marlo Thomas is that girl, is not, overly in your face with her feminism or her, even her independence. She just is. She's just living her life. And to her, it's not strange. It's not anything that's abnormal. It just, for her, it's her life. And I think that's what makes it so popular, is that it's just a normal, regular thing. And it shows up in the mid 60s, I believe, 65, 66, I want to say. But
wow.
Yeah. And here's this young, single, and attractive woman dating and doing just fine. When Mary Tyler Moore shows up, Mary is, I'm referring to Mary as if she and I are best friends, but Mary is by then a career woman. She knows what she wants. She knows who she is, and she is set, ready to go. And that's what makes her different from everybody else. She's not trying to find her dream. She knows she's going to work in journalism, and she finds a job as a news producer, and that's it.
Yeah, she's not like, her happiness isn't defined by having a husband or children. Her happiness is kind of defined by her success at work.
Yeah.
And even the theme song of Mary Tyler Moore is so significant that, like, the theme song starts by asking, "How will you make it on your own?" And then it's sung by a man, which I think is weird. When I hear the song in my head, I feel like it should be a woman singing it. It's such an iconic theme song. But it concludes by saying, "You might just make it after all." Like, she can make it on her own. That's the whole point of the show.
That's the whole point of the show. You're going to make it after all. Well, yeah, she's going to make it after all, because she's Mary. You're just going to have to deal with it. She throws her hat up in the air and everything. So we're good with you. Thank you, sir.
In fact, I read that, like, she originally, the network wanted to show her being divorced, but the creators of the show thought, no, that would make people think that she divorced Dick Van Dyke, like, back in the Dick Van Dyke show in the 60s. We want to make her as independent as possible. So she's portrayed as being single. In fact, she got out of a bad relationship with a guy who she put through med school. I think that's like the very first episode, is she's dumping this jerk that she helped put through med school. And then she goes out to make it on her own. Yeah. So,
I mean, what I love about Mary is she's not, she is a lot like Marlo Thomas's character, in that she's not making any apologies. She just is who she is. She's just living her life. Like, I want to say this is a couple of seasons into the series, where they make a reference to the pill, there was just it was a real brief reference to it. But her mom says, the scene is her mom says, "Don't forget to take your pill." And both Mary and her dad at the same time say, "I won't." And of course, she's referring to the pill. But in 1972, like, oh my God, who's talking about the pill on television? But
so what year did the pill become widely available? Was it?
That's in the 60s.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, but nobody's talking about it. Who's not? You could, I mean, that's insane. You couldn't even say pregnant in the 1950s when Lucille Ball was pregnant.
Oh, wow.
And so to make that progress is crazy. And here she is basically insinuating that she's having sex as a single woman.
A single unmarried woman.
I mean, she was brilliant. And and what I loved about her was even when she was, asking for equal pay or whatever, she was doing it in a way that fit her. She wasn't, she was a feminist, but being a feminist that fit her and not necessarily what fit others. The problem that has come up in feminist scholarship in recent years, and I would say in the last decade or so, is that the Mary Tyler Moore Show isn't as feminist as people say it is, and that sort of thing, because she wasn't as loud and proud about feminism as she should have been. But I think the problem with that sort of argument is that we have very specific expectations about what feminism looks like, sounds like, and behaves like. And that's really unfair. Not everybody is going to have that same sort of approach. And this particular character found her own way and made her own path and made it okay for women to make their demands in their way. I mean, she made herself essential to that team and made herself incredibly important to women everywhere. She made it okay to be on the pill. She made it okay to have sex before marriage, to be ambitious, to have a career, to have friends who were like her. She made it okay that you didn't have to be married. She made it okay that you could demand equal pay and demand it.
She also had a friend who was not like her, right? One of her neighbors was a very conservative, traditional woman. Was it Phyllis, I think?
Yes. And I mean, and she was bizarre in every sense of the word. I mean, all of her friends had their own sort of unique personalities, right?
Yeah.
And
all kind of three-dimensional characters, not...
Yes, all three-dimensional characters that you wanted to, I mean, Rhoda, of course, is the best of them, but like the others, even if you didn't want to hang out with them, you did just want to sit there and observe them for a good 10, 15 minutes and walk out on. But like, yeah, all of these women had depth and history, and you wanted to just be able to get to know and understand. And that's what this show did. This show was able to demonstrate that these women weren't just, one-dimensional people, that they all had their own histories, their own kind of purpose. That show was brilliant on so many levels.
There are a couple other portrayals of career women that I wanted to ask you about that come a little bit earlier than Mary Tyler Moore, back in the 60s. And speaking of Mary Tyler Moore, are you familiar with the Dick Van Dyke Show?
A little, but I should have brought my sister on for this. Obsessed with the Dick Van Dyke Show.
It's so great. There's a character, Sally Rogers is a female comedy writer for the show that Dick Van Dyke is on, and she's really like a strong woman in a man's world, and her portrayal on the show reflected her real life, really. I mean, she was one of the few women that was on the show in an active role. She is the typist on the show, so she's taking notes. She still has sort of a traditional role, but she really is on an equal basis with the other writers. And the character was loosely based on some female writers who'd wrote on 1950s and early 60s TV shows. She scares off men because she's too strong and independent.
Right.
And the actress who played her, Rose Marie, I'll just take a quick side note, is a fascinating human being. She died at age 94 in 2017. Her career started in the 1920s. She was at age 5. She was one of the biggest singing stars in America. She was on vaudeville and on the radio.
Wow.
Before Shirley Temple, she was like a huge child star before Shirley Temple, and then all the way up through the Dick Van Dyke Show, and then in the 90s, she was Frank Fontana's mother on Murphy Brown, and she continued to work in show business. She was also active on Twitter, and
yes, I followed her on Twitter.
She talked a lot about sexual harassment that she experienced, and she like encouraged women to come out and tell their stories. She was an amazing person. There's actually a documentary about her called Wait for Your Laugh, where a lot of people who worked with her spoke about what a powerful and important figure she was. Like Carl Reiner comes on and talks about her. Dick Van Dyke talks about her. And it came out like shortly before she died in 2017. It's really interesting. She was a fascinating character, and her character on the Dick Van Dyke Show was an interesting early portrayal of a woman in a traditionally male workplace.
You know, there is this sort of thing that comes around with those women, those characters who are in those roles where they are insanely funny because they're unafraid of being around men, and they're not intimidated by those men, and so they're willing to say whatever they want to say, and they do whatever they want to do, come hell or high water, they don't care. And yet at the same time, those women are also sort of portrayed as the anti-woman in a weird way.
Oh, okay.
You know, like they are not as feminine, they're not as delicate. And so you kind of have to be that woman, especially in Hollywood. The struggle is consistently having to fight back against that sort of, persona, because otherwise you're typecast, right? You're always going to be cast as that kind of personality. And that's just something that happens all the time, that if you are cast as or portrayed as someone who is just brash or aggressive or in somebody's face, then that's how it's going to go for the rest of your career. And it can work. Shout out to B. Arthur. It can work in different ways, or it can hurt you in other ways. I mean, so that is something that I think a lot of women had to keep in mind and be, or just at least be mindful of throughout their career.
Well, one more progressive show set in the American South that I wanted to ask you about in this category about career women is Designing Women. Did you watch Designing Women?
I love
What an amazing show.
Yes, it's an amazing show. And, Designing Women is a great show, primarily because it fights back against these stereotypes of Southern women while still maintaining its own distinct identity as Southern women. It's really interesting because they have to maintain this very delicate balance, right? Because they want to be known as Southern women. They take great pride in being Southern women. They take great pride in who they are and where they come from. But they also do this thing, which is something so rare, in that they take ownership of their history. They take ownership of the deep, dark history of slavery and the Civil War and all of that. They take ownership of those things and they face it. It's unheard of. I mean, even now it's something that the country struggles with.
Yeah, this
Like
was like
there's
the
one,
late 80s, early 90s, right? That's the
yes, there's one episode where the house where their business is hosted out of, the house is one of these is placed as a historic home, and it's put on tour, and the ladies are expected to dress as these sort of antebellum Southern women.
Oh, wow.
And they're so annoyed by the whole thing because it is clearly supposed to feed into this idea of what the South supposedly looked like.
Mm.
And immediately, Julia Sugarbaker, who is, of course, the heroine of the show and who always gives these amazing speeches, Julia speaks up finally out of all of her frustration and says, this is, this is not, none of this is true. She says, I'm sick of this. You just want to put on a show. None of this is true. We do not drink mint juleps. This is all
Oh, wow.
make money on a tour, but please leave. I can't do this anymore. And that sort of thing is so important because I mean, and again, and Designing Women was, they were dealing with those issues, but also political issues of the time, including the Clarence Thomas hearings. I mean, all
They talked about AIDS and homophobia.
yeah. I mean, they were not afraid of anything.
There's another episode where I think Julia goes to the doctor and he gaslights her. Basically, he tells her, "Oh, you're crazy. These symptoms aren't real,"
Yeah.
which is obviously a huge issue for women with doctors even today. That was really groundbreaking, I think, for the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, Designing Women does that. Golden Girls will do that as well. But there are these shows that are centered on women will go out of way to make sure they deal with those issues that women deal with on literally a daily basis, including those issues where doctors do not listen to women. And in that episode, and it's the same thing with Golden Girls, it was an episode in which basically the doctor was saying, you are being over dramatic. Oh. Your emotions are getting the best of you. You're hormonal and you are over exaggerating. You are making up the pain. It's all in your head, that sort of thing. And essentially the idea was she was being dismissed entirely. The thing about it is when you have shows that are centered on women, what you allow is for stories that will finally give a platform to these issues that women have been trying to give a spotlight for years, right? Whether it's healthcare or sexual harassment or equal pay. And television is the perfect platform because television, or now we have streaming, but whatever it is, the idea is to get to a place where everybody's going to come eventually. And if we can get it to a place where everybody's going to come and everybody's going to pay attention, then people don't have a choice. They're going to see it. And if they see it, then we've got their attention. And at least we can say we got the message to them. Now, what they do with it afterwards, that's on them. But at least we can get their attention. And that's what they were able to do in the 80s and the 90s. And it was incredibly powerful. And Murphy Brown does the same thing as well.
Oh, yeah.
Is it okay that I talk about Murphy Brown now?
Oh, please do, yeah.
I love Murphy Brown. I mean, I always compare Murphy Brown to Mary Tyler Moore, because Mary Tyler Moore is one way to approach feminism in the news. And then you have Murphy Brown, right? And Murphy Brown is the journalist who's in front of the camera. And what's brilliant about that show is that she was willing to be in your face, opinionated, aggressive, all of those things. but she was also willing to make headlines both on the show and in real life, and
Right.
incorporate both, right?
Hmm.
So her character becomes pregnant, which gets the attention of Vice President Dan Quayle. And when Dan Quayle made a speech about Murphy Brown getting pregnant, they included that on the show, which I thought was fantastic. And so now the show is about a working mom and how difficult it was and how overwhelming it was. And that was yet another issue that typically wasn't discussed in, on regular television. And yet here she was talking about it.
Even in the late 80s and early 90s, I think that's when the show ran. But I think people also criticized the show a little bit for portraying. I mean, she was a working single mother, but she did have like a live-in housekeeper. She had plenty of means. So
That's true.
Maybe the show didn't completely reflect the realities of many working single mothers, but still, just by raising the issue, it put it out there.
Yes, I mean, and one of the things that she did say, and I think this was the episode where she was watching Vice President Quayle make the speech, because he was talking about the glorification of single mothers, and she said, "What is so easy about this? What is so glory? What is so good about this? There's nothing about this." Because she said, "Even I'm struggling, and look at where I live." So she herself pointed out that there is nothing easy about this. There is nothing glamorous about this. She was just in that moment making the choice to have her child. And, and she wanted to have her career. She wanted to be able to pursue all of that while still being able to be a mother and have her child. And she was able to say, no, it's not easy. And no, this is not graceful or, joyous all the time at all.
So the next category of portrayals that we want to talk about is women of color on TV. What do you think what were some of the most significant portrayals of women of color?
I think you have to talk about Diane Carroll.
Oh.
Diane Carroll was in the first sitcom about a Black woman who wasn't a servant. And the whole show was about her, right? And
what show was that?
Julia.
Okay.
Yeah, and Julia debuted in 1968, and she was so the show was based on the premise that she was a nurse. So she was educated, she was a professional, and her husband died. And so she had I think 2 children, I want to say. But here's this woman who's raising her children. She was a nurse, and she would win a Golden Globe for this role. She was the first Black woman to be nominated for an Emmy. And then, this series would, of course, lead to other roles, because she would be on Dynasty later on in the 80s. The fierceness of Diane Carroll. Let me just add that. But Diane Carroll was pivotal in leading the way for a lot of Black women. The other thing, though, I do want to add is that she's not the only Black woman on television. It's just that she's the one that sort of makes it okay to have a sitcom centered entirely around a Black woman. And it
in 1968. Wow.
In 1968. When we talk about Black women on television, Norman Lear is a huge ally when it comes to people of color in general. And so Norman Lear, who just turned 98, by the way, on Monday. So happy belated birthday to Norman Lear. But like Norman Lear makes it possible for shows like The Jeffersons, and he's behind Good Times. So
All in the Family.
All in the Family, which is of course the big cornerstone show for him. But like when we talk about those shows on The Jeffersons, for example, you have characters with these strong Black women who hold their own. These women are three-dimensional women who are opinionated and hold their own, who have no problem with being able to take up their own space and have their own stories, and can really sort of take over a scene without any kind of without any real threat or problem. I mean, that's the genius of what he's able to do and sort of foster in his own way. Like I think about the Jeffersons, for example, and George Jefferson in particular. The character of George is larger than life, right? I mean, like that. This is not a guy that you can, just sort of walk around. Sherman Helmsley is a scene stealer from day one. I mean, even when he shows up as a guest star on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he steals every scene from Will Smith, and that's saying something. But
I think he started as a guest star on All in the Family too, right? It was a spin-off of All in the Family.
Yes.
Because he stole the show from Carol O'Connor.
He stole the show, and that's how he gets his own show. But when you think about characters like Louise or all of the women on The Jeffersons, Isabel Sanford, Florence Marla Gibbs, and Roxy Roker, the three Black women on that show, all of them find ways to be able to hold their own against Sherman Helmsley. And they can do it so well that it kind of demonstrates the power of Black women and their ability to kind of to be able to own the scene, right? And it kind of sets the tone for all of Norman Lear's shows, that he is able to take that into all of his shows and say, okay, if I can do it here, then I can do it in shows like Good Times. I can do it in shows like One Day at a Time, which is a single woman and her two teenage girls. That's, about women, white women, but still women, right? I mean, so women of color are able to gain a lot of momentum through Norman Lear programs, but then, it has to be in the late 60s, though. It's in the 60s where they gain a lot of their momentum.
Another late 60s portrayal I was curious if you're familiar with is, are you a Star Trek fan at all?
Oh, I was waiting for you to bring that up, Chris Carroll.
Lieutenant Uhura.
Yes. Uhura is key. Because if you don't have Uhura, you don't get Whoopi Goldberg in Next Generation.
Right.
And
Whoopi
Next
Goldberg,
Generation, just so you know, is the best of all the Star Treks. And you can fight me on that.
Okay, we're going to do a separate episode about how you're wrong about that. But
yeah, we can do that. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
But just like what you said about Diane Carroll's role, Whoopi Goldberg said she was amazed as a child. She saw Nichelle Nichols as Uhura on Star Trek, and she said, I saw a Black woman on television who's not a maid. That was the first time for her.
I mean, Uhura is, I will say this, when we talk about Star Trek, the original series, Uhura was brilliant, because the idea that you could have a Black woman on television as a communications officer, she wasn't just a throwaway character. She was essential. And I do remember her story about how Martin Luther King Jr. had to convince her that she was essential, that she had to be on that show because, people needed to see her on a science fiction program, that they needed to see her as an educated woman, as an educated character in this television program. She's pivotal. And not only that, but when you think about the vision of Star Trek and why Star Trek is so important anyway, and its overall message about the potential of humanity and the potential of all living beings, Uhura is really at the center of that, right? Uhura demonstrates that, as a woman of color, how important it is that she can be this bridge, right? Because that's really what a communications officer is. She's the bridge. She's the connecting force. She is able to connect her people, who are all of these individuals from all of these different backgrounds, into all of these new potential connections and beings that they've never encountered before. It's incredibly powerful.
You mentioned Martin Luther King. Oh, no. You mentioned Martin Luther King being, he was a fan of Star Trek. I've read that it's one of the few shows that he allowed his children to watch. And he told Nichelle Nichols, the actress who played Uhura, I have a quote actually. He said, "You are our image of where we're going. You are 300 years from now. And that means that's where we are." He said, "Keep doing what you're doing. You are our inspiration." She was planning on leaving the show after the first season. And he said, "Don't you understand? For the first time, we are seen as we should be seen. You don't have a black role. You have an equal role."
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, again, it gets into this, it gets to the power of television, right? I mean, we think of it as just sort of this throwaway thing, that it's just a source of entertainment. Why does it matter so much? Why does representation matter so much? This is exactly why. I will say, as a woman of color, and specifically as an Indian woman, it makes me so excited to see fellow Indians on television, just because I feel like my people have made it. There's a connection there.
Yeah.
And so, in the 60s, at the height of the civil rights movement of that time, to see a Black woman to be in that kind of position, and an important position at that, and to be able to have that role, it's so incredibly powerful and important. And I mean, of course he was right. Because it wasn't just a Black role. It was an equal role, and a powerful role at that. Yeah.
I did want to ask you, speaking of portrayals of Indian people on television, how do you feel about Mindy Kaling?
I mean, listen, I think what she has done is incredible as a creative person. I think what she has demonstrated is what she has demonstrated is that she is not just an Indian woman, that she is a creative artist. And so that's given me a tremendous amount of pride as an Indian woman, that she can both produce and write, and she has all of these different connections and avenues in which she can express herself. That's given me a great source of pride as an Indian woman. In terms of like her work, I'll be honest, I haven't watched a whole lot, but that's on me. So don't put that on her work. That's on me. And
there's too much TV out there. We're in the era of peak TV.
There's just too much. But it does give me so much pride to see that there are opportunities, and hopefully in years to come, there will be more for other Indian women and for other people of color and for other people who have been marginalized in the past to be able to come up and be able to express themselves on different platforms and in different ways.
And not just in front of the camera, but it seems very important that there are more roles, more diversity in the writers' rooms of shows and in production rooms.
Absolutely. I think that's also key is, I think it's great that in front of the camera, we see those people. It's important, as Dr. King pointed out, that you see someone like an Uhura, or you see a Whoopi Goldberg, or you see a Mindy Kaling. That's very important. But it's also important to recognize that those same people can write, that those same people can produce, that those same people can direct, because that sort of storytelling is just as valuable and just as important, that they can create. And that sort of creativity lends itself to, the whole idea of being able to contribute to the narrative. That's the thing, when we talked earlier about having shows that center on women and being able to bring those stories to the platform and why that matters so much. The thing is that, when you are a part of a marginalized group or a marginalized population, if you have writers and producers and creators from that marginalized population, they can help bring those stories to the forefront. And that's really the whole goal.
And maybe that's how you can get beyond something that I think often happens with characters of color, particularly women of color, that they are like the best friend character.
Yes.
Tons of shows like Orange is the New Black, Gilmore Girls, even The Handmaid's Tale, and children's shows. That happens constantly in children's shows, that the characters of color are sort of the friendly best friend character. It's so rare that they are this central character.
Right. I mean, I appreciate the effort that you want to diversify. I think that has become the goal, to diversify. But I think what really needs to be a part of it is inclusivity. It's the whole idea of every story matters, that we all contribute to the narrative. We all are a part of this entire fabric. And so my story matters just as much as your story. And together we can sort of contribute to what we all know and what we've all experienced. And that's the thing. I think, I think it would be interesting to see more of these stories available on these different platforms, just to see, because I've heard the argument, people don't watch those shows, people aren't interested in those shows. But that just simply isn't true. You just don't know unless you watch. I mean, again, I'm going to point to Norman Lear as an example. Norman Lear, as an ally, demonstrated that if the story is there, then just tell the story. And that's what draws people in. That's all you need. It's not necessarily that you have to have a certain look. It's just having the story there. That's what people are drawn to. I think that's really what has been so critical in the success of all of these shows and all of these characters. And so the fact that people of color could have these opportunities and these platforms, that's incredibly important.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the final category that we wanted to cover in our discussion of portrayals of women on TV is rebels, maybe the most fun category. We actually have a special guest who's just joined us. Elizabeth Bass has served as the Director of Publications at the Oklahoma Historical Society since 2012. She began her career at the OHS as an exhibits curator in 2005, and she moved to the Publications Division in 2010. She's currently finishing her doctoral dissertation in history at Oklahoma State University. And she's contributed to several encyclopedias and 2 books, and she works with OHS Executive Director Dr. Bob Blackburn to produce a monthly newspaper column for the Oklahoman entitled Connecting the Dots of History. And Elizabeth is also a member of the Oklahoma Humanities Board of Trustees. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be here.
Some people have speculated that the only reason we're doing this episode is to talk about Golden Girls. Sanu, I wish we were doing a video podcast because Sanu is wearing a Golden Girls t-shirt that says Stay Golden.
That's right.
The day we are recording this, I was just told, I'm getting a message here from the control room. I'm being told this is Golden Girls Day. We're recording this on Golden Girls Day.
That's right.
Yes.
I'm a recent convert, thanks to these guests. I'm a recent convert to watching the Golden Girls.
We like to evangelize.
Let's rewind that, please. And let's go back to the year of our Lord 2018. When young Chris Carroll mocked me on this show and said we would never do a show on the Golden Girls.
And here we are.
You should never say the word never. Never.
I'm telling you, I will get a crown in all of the heavenly places for my work.
I regret that episode is recorded and people can go back and hear that. So how do these four women in Miami, Florida, how are they rebels according to the way women are typically portrayed on TV? Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, first of all, they are not young. They are older women. They've already had families. And they're not connected to their families in any way. I mean, occasionally their children will come visit. 3 of them are widowed. 1 of them is divorced. There's no husband there. And they openly talk about dating and at an older age. I hesitate to call them old because, all those things are
About what age are they supposed to be on the show? Do we think are they in their 60s?
I think at one point I read something that said that Dorothy's supposed to be around 55. They're in their 50s, early 60s, maybe. Sophia's in her 80s, I think is what it's supposed to be, maybe. Yeah, anyway, they're kind of in this ambiguous older bracket.
Okay.
But it's obvious that they've already had a family. They've already raised their children. Their children are gone. They're making their own way. And they occasionally come in for episodes to show what they're doing or how they're not doing what their parents think they need to be doing or whatever. And obviously Dorothy's also in a kind of a caregiver role for Sophia, even though Sophia kind of helps take care of Dorothy too. But they aren't doing the typical things that people think that older women should be doing. They're not nurturing grandmothers. Grandkids show up. I don't even remember episodes with grandkids. Sinu, do you remember any episodes with grandkids? There's like a couple.
There are a few, but even then it's tricky because the grandkids show up and it's a little bit of an inconvenience because these 4 women have their own lives.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
wow.
Blanche's grandson shows up.
Yeah.
And her granddaughter will show up in a later episode, but it's all very inconvenient because these are 4 very independent women with their own lives and they can't be raising these children because they've got their own things to do.
Yeah. It's centered on them and not on how they interact with their family. Mm-hmm. It's what they want to do. It's their jobs because they all have some kind of employment except Sophia, who's much older. Dorothy's a substitute teacher. Rose works at one point. She's working at a news station. And actually there's an episode about ageism with Rose because she didn't get a job because she was older and they hired somebody younger and she was more qualified. Blanche works at an art museum. So they go out and they work. They have love lives that are more prominent for some of them as part of their character. But they're rebels in that it's about them and their relationship and the family they made amongst themselves. rather than focusing on how they are the nurturers of the families that they had before. Yeah. To me, that's one way to me that they are rebellious. Obviously, there's also the idea of sexuality and focusing on that with their dating lives and the constant jokes about Blanche's love life and that sort of thing.
I mean, for me, like the rebelliousness of the Golden Girls is the fact that they are exactly who they are without any apologies, right? They've come to this chapter of their lives and they can say exactly what they want and be exactly who they are and not care. I mean, the joke is always that it's Sophia who says and speaks her mind, and that's it. Because so they set it up in the pilot episode that Sophia had a stroke, and something happened to her brain where she just speaks whatever she thinks, and that's why she just says whatever she wants to say. But really, it's all four of them. They do what they want, and they are who they are, and really primarily it's because they've reached a phase in their life or a chapter in their lives where they just want to be able to pursue the lives that they've always wanted to live. They're still not entirely sure of what that's going to look like because they still are trying to figure some things out. Like Dorothy would still like to be able to have a nice husband. They all still want to be able to have steady relationships with someone. They still want to be able to do certain things, and they don't have all the answers to all the questions, but they're going to do it in their way, and they're not going to do it based on what somebody else says to them or what somebody else expects of them. And that to me is quite rebellious, especially in the 80s and early 90s. That's quite something.
One of the reasons I hate myself for not watching Golden Girls before this is because it's set in Florida.
Your friend Sinu. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Continue.
The show is set in Florida, and I grew up in Florida. I'm from Florida. I mean, the way it portrays Florida is fascinating too, but as you've said, I mean, Florida is a place where many older people go to retire, and it's older people are a cohort of our population that's often forgotten, and we think their lives are basically over. But from the shows I've watched, I mean, the Golden Girls are portrayed as going back to college. They're portrayed as trying to improve their careers still, and like you said, they're still seeking out relationships. It does seem like a really revolutionary portrayal of, I'll put it in quotes, of older Americans.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they're
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say they're also seeking their own family. They, instead of staying with their children or in the places that they live, Rose comes from St. Olaf, and Dorothy and Sophia are coming from New York. They come down to Florida. They leave where they were and they come down there, and they find each other because Blanche needs roommates. She needs the people to live with her because her husband has passed away. She needs help paying for the mortgage. So they are roommates, but they become family, and they realize that there's different times where they, talk about being best friends and they talk about being family when outsiders kind of threaten that unit. So they also create a family for themselves in addition to the actual families that they have that, make cameo appearances here and there.
Mm-hmm. What I love about their individual lives too is that they have these networks. Sophia is probably the best at this because she seems to have the strongest network of the four of them. And you see this throughout the show. Like outside of the four of them, Sophia has all of these connections. Like she has her different clubs, and she has the women that she'll volunteer at a hospital, or she has the people that she plays bridge with.
A network of Sicilian people who can get her tickets to concerts whenever she wants.
And
her brother and sister, Angela and Angelo.
That's right. Angela and Angelo. She has all of these different people that she connects with, which makes her so fascinating because she's the oldest of them, right? She's, in her early 80s, and she's the one that you expect to be the one to stay at home, to be the most feeble, the weakest, and yet she's the one who is the caretaker of all of them, right? She's the one that everyone goes to for advice. She's the one that everyone goes to for the stories, but she's also the one who goes out to see what everybody else needs. She's the one who's networking. She's the one who's got all the connections. It's really, it's so much fun to watch how independent their lives are. And the constant reminder with every episode is that your life isn't over. These women have come to Florida not to end their lives or not to live out the rest of their lives in quiet retirement. No, this is just the next chapter. And it's just another chapter of love and family and joy.
Yeah, we've talked a bit in this episode about how powerful it is to see representations on television. It must have been and must continue to be powerful for older viewers. I'll count myself as an older viewer. I mean, I'm in my 40s. To see these representations of women who are this active and this, I mean, they're involved in politics, they're involved in local politics. Can you talk a little bit about the array of social issues that are addressed on the show?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, they talk about AIDS. They talk about gay people when nobody was talking about gay people. The episode where, well, actually it's kind of a series. There's a few in there where Blanche's brother is coming out to her. It's very real. It's he had been afraid to tell her this, and he has this long-term relationship, and he wants to get married. This is the 80s. He wants to get married. And he finally feels comfortable enough to tell her. Of course, she doesn't take it particularly well. It's, I don't mind that he's gay, but why does he have to have a boyfriend? That's the laugh line that they give you on that. But, over the course of the episode, by talking to the other members of the other household members, she can see that this is her brother's life. This is her brother's love. Why can he not have this relationship? What is this affecting you? This is his life. And eventually over time she can get there to where it's okay. But the reaction is that her initial reaction is something that would be supremely real to the situation. And then you get to the point where there's an evolution there to at least a level of acceptance.
Could we talk just a little bit about, for lack of a better word, the badassness of B. Arthur?
Yes.
What an American hero B. Arthur is.
That is like a whole episode unto itself.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
B. Arthur is a queen. I cannot emphasize that. I mean, my first exposure to B. Arthur was TV Land, because it was an old episode of All in the Family. She was guest starring as Maude. And I remember thinking to myself, because it was when she just showed up, right? And what was, the woman was sick. What was Bunker's wife's name?
Edith, thank you.
So Edith was sick. Maude shows up to save the day because, of course, Archie's not going to do anything. And that's what Maude says. And I remember being a kid thinking, who is this badass? I love her. And then I saw Golden Girls and I was like, that's it. I'm Dorothy. I want to be Dorothy. I am all things Dorothy. I worship at the altar of Dorothy. I love everything about B. Arthur, primarily because, of course, she is strong and opinionated and hysterical. It's, those one-liners are brilliant. But there's also a vulnerability about her that I think you miss if you don't pay attention. There is something about her love, the love that she has for her mother, the love that she has for her friends, for her children, in this character of Dorothy, that I think makes me so drawn to her. And I think that's what I love the most about her, is that she's willing to just do anything and everything for them. And I think is, I love her strength, but I love that vulnerability even more. And to me, that's what makes her a whole person, a whole human being, is that she is intelligent and funny and witty, and unafraid and in your face, but she's also all of these other things as well. And I adore her. I love Dorothy, but B. Arthur portraying her is just brilliant.
Well, and the story that they give that character,
yes,
she's pregnant. She gets pregnant as a teenager. She has to marry this man.
Yeah.
Good old Stan.
Yeah.
And, then you fast forward through her entire, and basically what most people consider most of your life. And then all of a sudden she finds out he's cheating on her and he leaves her and they divorce. And so she's left 38 years later, essentially starting over in most people's view. And so her moving to Miami, it's a whole new world. It's a whole new bunch of opportunities. It's a new place for her to start over. And then of course Stan keeps showing up, but she can shove him out the door and, close the door in his face all those times.
Yeah.
He gets in occasionally.
Yeah.
But seeing her regain, it's kind of a seeing her regain confidence in a way, throughout the years of the show, leading up to the point where she gets remarried to Leslie Nielsen.
I have not gotten there yet in my watching of Golden Girls.
Sorry,
wow.
spoiler alert.
All right, Chris.
And I will say, one of the ugliest wedding dresses I've ever seen in my life.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a huge injustice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fashion of the Golden Girls is a whole other issue. Like, that's a whole thing unto itself.
I knew a bit about B. Arthur, and I knew she was really an amazing person before I watched any of Golden Girls. And I think I anticipated that she would be 100% badass on the show, but I really appreciate that she, like you said, she's shown as being very vulnerable, and she can be wrong. She's wrong a lot of the time. She misjudges people, including her best friends. It's like such a three-dimensional human portrayal.
Yeah, I love that she I love that she is willing to call out people, but at the same time, she's called out in different ways as well. It's not in the same sort of like viper type of way that she would call out people, but she's
a great word.
Put down in different ways, right? I also love the dynamic between her and Sophia. It's so wonderful because Sophia is the one person who can just take her, and it's it's really my favorite relationship in that whole show because
Shady Pines, Ma.
yes, it's the one phrase. It's the one phrase that's just your constant throughout 7 seasons. It's brilliant. It's just brilliant. I do want to talk about one social issue, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I do want to talk about the social issue of AIDS for a second.
Oh, yeah.
Because when they talked about AIDS, the timing is really important here because the AIDS episode came up while the Ryan White thing was going on.
Oh.
And Ryan White, remember, like that whole thing, he was kicked out of school. This kid got it because of a blood transfusion, for crying out loud.
He was like 12 years old.
Yeah, he's just 12 years old. And people were assuming all sorts of things. They still had no idea, no understanding about what AIDS was. There's still all of this assumption that it's a gay man's disease. And the way that it was told on this show was so well done because it's Rose that has the AIDS scare.
Exactly.
Not anybody else. It's Rose.
Yeah,
Rose gets it because of a blood transfusion.
Yeah, and you couldn't have they couldn't have told that story any better.
That's it. That's exactly right. They couldn't have done it any better because Rose was the goody two shoes who gets it because of a blood transfusion. And there's a brilliant scene in the episode where she and Blanche confront each other, and Rose says to Blanche, "You must have slept with hundreds of men." And Blanche says to her, "Wait a second, are you saying that I should have had AIDS? I should have gotten this disease?" And Rose, of course, immediately backs off of that. And Blanche confronts her and says, AIDS is not a bad person's disease. AIDS is not God punishing man for his sins. And that confrontation and that scene and that whole episode is so significant because it is the conversation that the country needed to hear in that moment. Because here's this 12-year-old kid who has been rejected by society, but there's also a population of gay men who weren't being heard and who were also being rejected, right? And so here are these two women who are speaking up for all of these people. And it was so important.
And again, it's an older woman.
Yeah.
It's not a younger woman. It's not someone in the 20 to 30-year-old range.
Yes.
It's a woman in her 50s or 60s who's dealing with this.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, the last show I wanted to bring up, Elizabeth, I don't know if you're a fan, but there is a show that I think portrays every one of the 4 categories that we've talked about today. That's Game of Thrones.
Do it.
Elizabeth, are you a Game of Thrones fan?
I've not been. I have kept up with the popular culture in other ways. I know many people who are.
Yeah, you almost can't avoid it.
I have kept up through osmosis, shall we say.
Right.
And Elizabeth, your job right now is to keep us focused on not getting angry. This is your job. That's fine.
So Game of Thrones, I mean, there are traditional portrayals. I think Catelyn Stark, Ned Stark's wife, maybe Sansa originally is portrayed in a traditional fashion. There are, I would argue there are career women. You could say Daenerys and Cersei are career women. They have careers. There's maybe, it famously falls short in the category of women of color. Miss Andy is maybe the only woman of color with any significant role in the show. You could say our final category, rebels. Daenerys, maybe she's a rebel. Arya is certainly a rebel. Cindy, I'm just going to let you take this. How do you feel about the way women were portrayed on Game of Thrones?
I have to remember that. So in terms of the portrayal of women, okay, here's the thing. I think, I think you can argue, and well, I would argue that this show actually does a couple of things. One, it successfully demonstrates that women are more than just one thing at one time. That you could have women as leaders who are also sexual beings, who were also vulnerable, who were also this, who were also that, who were also family women, who were also mothers, who were also wives. I liked the fact that you could have women who were multiple things all at once. That's the success of this show. In terms of women's roles, I think one of the problems that historically that we've had in terms of women's roles on television is that the struggle has always been that women had to fit into one specific category, that she had to be a career woman, that she had to be a sexual icon, that she had to be a single woman, that she had to be this woman. And I think what Game of Thrones did manage to do is that it demonstrated that you could be multiple things all at one time. And that's okay. When you look at Cersei, for example, here is Cersei who was trying to protect her children. You can see that from the very beginning, her number one priority was her children. Granted, her children were a product of incest. That's a separate issue. We won't discuss that here. But her children are definitely her first priority. So motherhood is a part of who she is. However, over the course of the evolution of the show, she also becomes obsessed with power and the preservation of her family. And in terms of her family, we're not just talking about Jaime and her 3 children. We're also talking about the name, the Lannister name, and her legacy and the throne, and what does this all mean and represent. And she also, again, over the course of the show, she also is talking more and more about strategy, and she demonstrates her own intelligence and her ability to remember historical things and what her father taught them. And she, on her own, if we just look at her, she demonstrates that ability to be all of those things at one time. And that's, I think, something that we can say is a strength of the show. I know that there were a lot of critics or people who believed that because of the sexual nature of the show, that it was 10 steps back or whatever for the portrayal of women on the show. But here's the thing. Game of Thrones is very much set in a time of war. And the thing is rape is a weapon of war. This is the reality of humanity. It just is what it is. If you study any kind of war in human history, rape is a weapon of war. It's not always just battles on a battlefield. There are stories of rape, and Game of Thrones brought that to the forefront. And that's another part of women's roles on this program, is that it showed how women's bodies were objectified in the name of war. And that was another significance of this show, is the objectification of women's bodies in the name of war. So that's the flip side of it.
Can I ask you a quick question? Do you think that the idea of women thinking about legacy and thinking about that sort of thing is something was unique to Game of Thrones, or that Game of Thrones brought out in a way that other programs may not have? Because so many of the women were seeking that power. They were seeking to grasp those things. And whereas you haven't seen, not that I have noticed, seen programs where so many different women have been going for kind of the same goal with the same mindset. Do you think that is something that's kind of, it kind of goes along with what you've already said?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the difference, though, maybe with Game of Thrones and perhaps other shows, is in how it's portrayed. I think that's maybe the difference. Because I think if you look at or pay attention to other shows, because immediately I'm thinking of all of those dramas, all of those television, like primetime dramas.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just a different setting.
It's just a different setting and a significantly different, storyline, but the goal is the same, right? It's legacy. It's, it's your name. Like immediately I'm thinking of all of those shows from the 80s, like Dynasty and or Dallas.
Falcon Crest. Yeah, Dallas.
Yeah,
right.
It's just,
and it's still the same motivation.
Yeah. This just kind of puts armor on it and makes it more warlike, instead of being, in a way, more about not rape but sex and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, in Game of Thrones, I think what makes it unique is that women are at the forefront in a much more violent way.
Yeah.
Whereas in all of these other dramas, it's much more strategic and it's a lot more dramatic in other ways. And
maybe manipulative behind the scenes.
Yeah.
It's more the women are manipulating things behind the scenes with the stereotypical manipulative woman rather than the violent.
Yes.
It's the difference between the role you would typically see for a man in violence and the role you would typically see for a woman in being manipulative.
Right.
Yeah, there's a woman on Game of Thrones who holds the ultimate weapon, a flying dragon that can destroy a city. It's only under her control.
Yeah.
Maybe that leads us to the ultimate disappointment of the show, which you've kind of pointed toward. There are all these strong women who are contenders for the throne, and then we get Bran. Sorry, Elizabeth. Spoiler alert.
Cool. It's cool. I kept up. Like I know what happened, and
we get a mediocre white.
Really disappointed. So
yeah, we get a mediocre white man in the end.
So all this time that's what you're going to lead me to? All this time, all these years of my life for that? Okay, great. Thank you. That's what it was. I can't. Oh my God. Chris, change the topic, Chris. Change the topic.
That's probably as good a point as any to wrap up here.
I gotta go finish my Golden Girls cheesecake.
I mean, he says to Tyrion, "Oh, of course, you saw this coming, or I saw this coming. Why do you think I'm here? What? Get out of here with your, I can't."
That's on the writers. That is on the writers.
Yeah. Those guys saw other things to do and they cut it. Yeah, I can't.
That's going to be the most important character, and you spend 6.5 seasons not setting this up at all for him to be interesting or important? Okay,
no,
sorry.
I can't.
I think I need to send both of you some cheesecake.
Yes, please. Immediately. DoorDash that over.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. This is maybe the most fun episode we've ever done. Sanu and Elizabeth, really appreciate you being here. We're going to create a web page for this episode that will have links to more information about some of the stuff we talked about. Just really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Hey, our pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was fun.
Well, you can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. please give us a rating. And you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Moreva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. That's very important in this episode. So this has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.